Hello, it's Adam here from the Tudor Chest. This week's episode is going to be a bit different. I was due to be chatting with the wonderful Dr Helen Castor all about she-wolves, her book on some of the most iconic badass women from medieval history, but sadly that's been delayed by a couple of weeks. A follower of mine messaged me over the weekend and said that she'd love to know more about my own story, that so much of the episodes each week is about me chatting with guests about their lives as historians, their opinions, their backstory, and she felt it would be nice for people to hear the same stuff about me. And so I thought, well, why not? And so this week, prepare to get to know me, Adam Pennington, a bit better as I discuss my own life, my love of history, and of course, some of my opinions. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 112, History and Me, with me, Adam Pennington. So with this, I'm going to be asking myself the questions that I typically would ask people, that I would want to probe them on, and explain my take on it, and also my story, I suppose. And I always start by asking people where they grew up and what their family background was. Now, I'm sure there's some people who know immediately that I grew up in quite a historically concentrated part of England, but for those who don't, I grew up in Surrey, predominantly, which is a county just south of London. And actually, where I grew up was basically right on the border between Surrey and London. And the thing that my closest friends constantly take the piss out of me for, because I do mention it quite a lot, but it is true that my childhood home basically all but overlooked Nonsuch Park, which is the park that at one point housed the famous Nonsuch Palace, Henry VIII's great, extravagant palace that was something of a white elephant. It was never properly finished and was just something of a midlife crisis for Henry VIII, of which he had many. But yeah, it was in the grounds of Nonsuch Park, which is the park is still there. Nothing of the palace remains, just some markers to tell us where it roughly stood. But that park is a huge part of my life. When I was little, it's where I learned to ride a bike. It's where we took the dogs when I was... Well, it's where we took the dogs when I was little. It's where I'd take my dog every single day for a walk. I've even got the coordinates of Nonsuch tattooed on the back of my left arm. It's literally my favourite place in the world. And so I think it had a massive bearing on history just being on my doorstep. And it also meant that because of where I grew up, I was also very lucky that big historical sites were pretty much on my doorstep. So Hampton Court Palace was a 15-minute drive away. Central London with the Tower of London and Westminster Abbey and the other big historical sites was 30 minutes on the tube. So it was very handy, really, growing up where I did. And I kind of feel like history was inevitably going to rub off on me. And actually, Professor Susanna Lipscomb grew up very close to me. Well, she went to Nonsuch Girls' School, which again is within Nonsuch Park, which is something she and I have discussed before. So yeah, so that's, I suppose, my background. And I think that is where the passion for history began. But where it really kicked off, firstly, my mum's a Londoner and she's always loved history. And when my sister and I were growing up, she was very insistent that we understood history, that we understood the significance of the monarchy in Great Britain. I was brought up in a very monarchist household, which is still the case today. And because of that, my mum was also very insistent that if we had days off from school or in the 6 weeks holiday in the British summertime, they weren't going to be wasted. So we would go up to London, we would go to see stately homes, and it just really began to rub off on me. I just found it so fascinating. And then when I was 9 or 10, I mean, everyone assumes that British children just must learn about all of our history. And my British listeners are going to be going, nope, because that is not the case at all. We learn about the Tudors and we learn about World War One and World War Two. And this is, when I say we learn, I'm talking about just the standard education that every child goes through. Obviously, if you follow history further down the line, then you're going to learn about more things, but almost like the standard curriculum. At least growing up when I did, it was the Tudors, it was World War One and Two. You might do a bit on the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans and the ancient Egyptians, and you might do a little sprinkling of 1066. But that was it. There was no, after 1066, it was almost like nothing happened until the Tudors, and then the Stuarts, the Hanoverians, the Victorians, nearer looking. You almost went straight to World War One and World War Two. But so for that reason, my mum was always really passionate about my sister and I understanding history, and she's always said that, you know, any British person who can't name the 6 wives of Henry VIII in order has no business claiming to be a Brit, and I obviously agree. But yeah, that's, I suppose, where it started. And then when I started learning about the Tudors for the first time around the age of 9 or 10, one weekend, by pure chance, Anne of the Thousand Days was on television. I was hooked. My mum allowed me to watch it, even though I was 10 or so, and it, you know, it does have a sex scene, it has executions in it, but my mum let me watch it, and I became utterly transfixed with Anne Boleyn's story from there on, and is also the reason why Geneviève Bujold is, for me, the quintessential Anne Boleyn, because she was the first Anne Boleyn that I saw depicted in film and television. So that film had a massive bearing on my passion, particularly for Anne's story. And after that, I then fell down the rabbit hole of wanting to watch all of the other film and television shows that were out in the, I mean, there weren't any out when I was a child. They were from the 1970s. So we had those the Keith Michel film, Henry VIII and his 6 wives, and then the TV series, The 6 Wives of Henry VIII. I watched both of those. I watched Lady Jane with Helena Bonham Carter. I watched Mary Queen of Scots with Glenda Jackson and Vanessa Redgrave. So I was absorbed it all like a sponge, really. Did I study history is a question I get asked a lot, and I didn't. I studied history as far as GCSE level, which for people outside of the UK, your GCSEs in the UK are your first qualification that you get. You do those at the age of, well, you finish them at the age of 16. So I did a history GCSE, but nothing higher than that in history. My A-levels weren't in history. A-levels is what you do between 16 and 18, and then if you choose to, you go on to university. I went to university. I went to the University of Brighton, and I studied media and communication, and that's the career path that I actually followed. So I did not train as a historian in the traditional sense. I always loved it, and it was always my passion, but I don't know why I didn't really think it could be a career, sort of naively. I didn't know what that would even look like, because I had no desire to teach. And I think back when I was doing my GCSEs and my A-levels, to be a historian, it wasn't like it is today, where you've got social historians, which I suppose is what you could class me as. Back then, it was, you went into teaching, academia, or you became a sort of very scholarly author. There wasn't that breadth of other opportunity. So I think that's why I didn't follow it up, because I didn't actually have the desire to necessarily be a teacher. So I went into the media industry and graduated from university, worked in the media, and for a really long time, I worked for an events company. I say an events company, I worked for an event that happens in Cannes, in the south of France, and it was a British company, but the event was in Cannes, called Cannes Lions, and I worked for, it was simply put, I worked for the Oscars of advertising. So if you work in the advertising industry, so if you work for a big brand like L'Oreal or Burberry or Coca-Cola or whatever, or you work for a big ad agency or a big tech company like TikTok or Apple, the biggest award in the world for the advertising industry is called a Cannes Lion. And I worked for them for 13 years, up until 2023, actually, doing event operations, event management, commercial side of things. So that's what I did, but I always loved history. And then, so in the pandemic, when a lot of people were having that moment of going, okay, can I do a bit of a reset, or can I have a sort of side hustle or a side hobby, basically? Could I do something? And that's when I thought, okay, why don't I create a blog where I can just write about my opinions on Tudor history and just talk Tudors with people, basically. So that's when I created the Tudor Chest. And it took me ages, like these things do, to think of a name for the blog as it was then that I was creating. And I suppose it's now slightly spiraled into more of an identity, I guess. But I was trying to think about, what does a repository of ideas and stories and opinions look like? And I thought, I thought of opening up cupboards, and from there I just landed on chest, because chests were things that the Tudors had, and I thought it was explained what I was looking to try and do, basically, which is that you can open this chest, and within that you can learn about all manner of things. It doesn't just have to be who people from Tudor England were, but also portraiture, books, places, lesser known figures, lesser known stories. So that's how it started. It was a pandemic idea. I created my Instagram account accompanying it. I created my website, thetudorchest.com, which I will admit has taken something of a backseat of late. But the Instagram account really took off and grew quite quickly. And then I was approached by a publishing house who'd read some of my blogs and asked if I would be interested in submitting an idea to write a book about Margaret Pole and her family. And bear in mind, I still had a full-time job at this point. So I thought, okay, is this actually that fork in the road where I can go, right, now is the time to see if I can carve a career out of this and actually go full-time historian? So that's what I did. And I left my job at Cannes Lions in July 2023 after 13 years. There was a lot of tears. There was I was heartbroken, but also incredibly excited. And I was writing the book in tandem with having my full-time job. I only finished the book a few months after going full-time historian, for want of a better term. But it was that really, the fact that the Instagram account had grown, and then having this book deal. And I also had an idea for a tour company, which I'll come to in a moment, that I thought, okay, maybe now is the chance to do it. So that's really where it came from. And that's how my book came about. So I wrote a book, as many of you I'm sure know, about Margaret Pole and her family. It's called Henry VIII and the Plantagenet Poles, the Rise and Fall of a Dynasty. And I loved writing it. I mean, I loved diving into the records. I loved writing about this family who are reasonably well known. I refer to them as the B-list, I suppose is how we might consider them today. But that was what I loved about writing that book, was having the opportunity to just not talk about Margaret, but the wider family. And I think what I was very attracted to was making people aware of what else was going on with Margaret and her story, because a lot of people are aware of her very badly botched execution, but they're not really sure what led up to it and why. And I think when that penny dropped and I went, okay, here is the story. The story's twofold. There's telling the story of these people who had a much greater claim to the throne than Henry VIII did. And then there's the fact that the Exeter conspiracy, the thing that destroys Margaret, was much bigger than people believe and led to 8 executions, 12 arrests. So I really wanted to tell that story, I guess. If I were to give someone a piece of advice, this is something I learned, absolutely, and I can't remember who taught me it, but it's absolutely the case when I was looking at the records. So if you're listening to this and you're working on your first book, a piece of advice that is absolutely true is, if you're dealing with a subject, if you're dealing with a person or a family who fall out of favour, which most people did with Henry VIII, a really good indicator of opinions shifting for the good. So, the relationship with Henry thawing and things improving is to look at Christmas and New Year's gift rolls and lists, because if you can see gifts being sent to Henry VIII and them not being returned, and vice versa, Henry VIII sending gifts to people that were previously out in the cold, that's a really good sign that the situation is thawing and that the relationship is mending. So that is a piece of advice I would give to people. It was absolutely the case with Margaret Pole and her family after the debacle with Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham's execution. After 4 years in the wilderness, Margaret Pole's gift to Henry VIII was not returned. So I was able to go, right, okay, there we have a moment where things change. So that is a piece of advice I would give to people. Now, what is my favourite Tudor book? Well, it's undoubtedly The Private Lives of the Tudors by the magnificent Tracy Borman. I know Tracy personally. She is obviously a total goddess in Tudor history world, and she's so sweet, so lovely, and The Private Lives of the Tudors is just the most fantastic book. I mean, it's what's brilliant about it is it's full of just little juicy tidbits and fascinating little stories. It's told very much through the prism of the 5/6 Tudor monarchs, but it is the private lives, it's behind the scenes, and it's fascinating. I bought it for my mum as one of her Christmas presents a few years back, and she couldn't put it down. I mean, it's just the most remarkable book. So if you're looking for a book actually that is really accessible and full of detail, The Private Lives of the Tudors by Tracy Borman is absolutely the way to go. Now, some of the other questions I always ask people are, if they could jump in a time travel machine and witness a single moment, what would it be? And I've given myself the option of doing this twice because I've become increasingly more and more fascinated by the Plantagenets and actually the Anglo-Saxons. And I would now say that actually, and I'm not going to do a rebrand, but I am just as interested in the Plantagenets and the Anglo-Saxons as I am the Tudors. So I've broken this question into two. As far as a moment from Tudor history, and I'm sure listeners will probably already know, because I've mentioned it before, but it would absolutely be the coronation of Anne Boleyn, because Anne Boleyn is my historical heroine. She's my number one figure that I'm the most fascinated with. So I would love to see the day that was undoubtedly her greatest triumph. I would love to see what actually happened. How did it play out? I'd love to get confirmation as to whether the crowds were as hostile as we've been led to believe. I think it would be so fascinating as well to look around the congregation that had assembled to witness this coronation and go, oh, okay, I know that person based on my knowledge of portraits. I think that would be so fun. And then also to just think, I don't know who people that are going to be right in the front are going to be obviously very significant people. So it'd be quite fun to go, oh, okay, I don't know who that is. So try and determine who different people are. I just think it would be an amazing moment from history to witness the absolute zenith of Anne Boleyn as queen and her story, I guess. I think it's just the peak. And the follow-up to that is, if I had an opportunity to change a moment from Tudor history, what would it be? Now, I wouldn't change a moment from Tudor history. What I would actually do, though, is I would jump in a time travel machine, go to the deathbed of Henry VIII and whisper in his ear, by the way, it's the man that determines the sex of a child. Just letting you know that. Bye. Just to see his little piggy eyes bug out, hopefully, and realise that he'd been wrong all along. And I suppose the follow-up to that could be, oh, and by the way, Elizabeth is your greatest successor. Peace out, and then go back to 2025. As far as having the opportunity to witness a moment from Plantagenet history, This is much more difficult because it's over 300 years and so much happened. But I think it would be truly fascinating to see the origin, the true beginning of the marriage, of the relationship between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. Did they meet by the roadside, as legend suggests? Did she pull a knife on him? I'd like to know how accurate that story is. So that would be quite fun to look at. I would also love, and Catherine Hanley, who I had on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, said this, but that moment when Empress Matilda captures Stephen. Now, actually, this is pre-Plantagenet, so that could be that's my Normans. That could be my Norman one. So yeah, I would have that. If I were having a Norman moment to look back on, it would be that. So when Empress Matilda captures Stephen and Stephen is brought to her, that would just be the most, to be a fly on the wall in that incredibly awkward conversation. And then, yeah, I think it would probably be either Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, or definitely something with Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Would be fascinating. I'd love to know what Eleanor of Aquitaine looked like, because we don't really have any clue. There's suggestion she was blonde. That's about it. So I think that would be one that I'd love to see as a celebration or something, where we have Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II and their sons, the man that became Richard I, Bad King John. I'd love to see this family unit at work. As far as the Tudor misconception that I'd love to correct, because that's another question I often ask people, there's no doubt for me, I would love to correct people's constant misconception around Jane Boleyn. And again, this is one I've mentioned probably in the past, but there really is no evidence to support the theories about her being this evil shrew who deliberately tried to destroy her husband and her sister-in-law, George and Anne Boleyn. The evidence just isn't there. Actually, when we follow the evidence, what George Boleyn says in his trial is that you're going to judge me based on the word of one woman. And that was believed to be, well, I don't even know if it was believed to be, but at some point in history, that was turned into, that must be Jane Boleyn. And it wasn't. At least I firmly believe it wasn't Jane Boleyn, because the person that it was, it's actually really obvious who it was, and that was Lady Worcester. Because she told her brother was telling her off for supposedly being a bit too loose living, shall we say, and she said, it's nothing compared to what the Queen gets up to with her brother. So we know it was Lady Worcester. So where Jane Boleyn, I mean, it's just that classic thing of royal women tearing each other down. It pisses me off. We still see it today, sadly. And because Jane and George didn't have children, that's used as a sort of stick to beat them both with. How do we know that Jane didn't have early miscarriages? Or how do we know that George may have been impotent? We can't say that a lack of children was thus suggestive of a horrendously bad marriage. That's putting such onus on something that can't be proven. So I've never really understood where that hatred of Jane Boleyn comes from. If we follow the facts, if we follow the history, it just isn't really there. As people will also know, and I mentioned this earlier, I was brought up in a monarchist household. I'm a staunch monarchist. I think we only have to look at some of the elected head of states around the world right now to see the virtues of a monarchy. So if I were to answer a misconception about the royal family that I would love to correct, I'm going to take a really easy one because it really gets on my nerves, and it's the pronunciation of Princess Eugenie's name. Now, you've probably just heard me say it, but I'm going to go back over it because what annoys me actually is that I have watched people who claim to be, and are, they don't claim it, they are, to be fair to them, royal journalists, royal commentators, appearing at the Queen's funeral or the coronation, at Eugenie's own wedding, reporting, and her name is repeatedly repeatedly butchered, and I just find it really annoying. And I saw it's a misconception that I'd just love people to correct. A lot of people call her Eugenie or Eugenie or Eugenie. It's none of those. It's Eugenie. It's the middle syllable that really trips people up. They get the first and the third syllable okay. It's the second one. It's je. So pronounce it as if you're spelling it J-U-H. So it should be Eugenie. 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 I've just done it 3 times for you. So hopefully now, folks, you will go Princess Eugenie rather than Eugenie. That's the one that I think I hate the most because it just sounds horrible. And as I say, people get it wrong all the time. And when they do get it right, I'm always clapping away quietly in the corner. If I were to try and resurrect a Tudor building that's now entirely lost, what would I pick? I was asked this question to my friend Sarah Morris, who created Simply Tudor Tours with me, which I'll discuss in a moment. I mean, I would resurrect the Palace of Whitehall just to see it, but it would also destroy huge chunks of London because the Palace of Whitehall was a sort of palace that just had loads of bolt-ons to it. It started as one thing and then it just grew and grew and grew over different generations and decades. So it kind of became this big rambling warren of different styles and monarchs who were overseeing it. But there is essentially nothing left today. But the Palace of Whitehall was the beating heart of Henry VIII's court in particular. It was so fundamental to the reign of Henry VIII. So much happened at Whitehall and we have nothing of it. I mean, there's a wall. There's a wall, and the banqueting house is still there, but that was a Stuart invention. So it would probably be the Palace of Whitehall. But it would be something that a lot of people don't know is actually how much of the Tower of London is lost as well. There used to be a Great Hall at the Tower of London. It ran east to west rather than north to south, just south of the White Tower, which obviously still remains. But the Great Hall was where Anne Boleyn was tried. It was where George Boleyn was tried, and nothing of the Great Hall remains. So it'd be fascinating to see that. I believe that the Great Hall at Winchester is very close in style, but that will be amazing to see. And also the other lost parts of the Tower of London, the lost royal apartments. There's a real misconception that drives me and other historians mad. The yeoman warders, the beefeaters as they're also known, regularly tell stories at the Tower of London that are by and large drivel. The chief one being that the plaque which commemorates the spot where Anne Boleyn was supposedly executed, that's totally inaccurate. If you want to stand where Anne Boleyn was executed, if you want to stand in the actual spot, it's basically where people queue up to go into the crown jewels. So if you stand there and face the White Tower, because based on the records, we know that Anne faced the White Tower. So you have your back to the entrance to the crown jewels, you're basically standing where Anne Boleyn was executed. Where the plaque is possibly where Margaret Pole actually was executed, but we know was not the spot where Anne Boleyn was buried. The yeoman warders will tell you it is. They'll also tell you that that's where Anne was housed, because there's a building there called the Queen's House. It's not the case at all. The Queen's apartments, the royal apartments, used to be towards where the cafe is, to the southeast of the White Tower, is where there used to be the royal apartments. That is where Anne Boleyn had her royal apartments, where she stayed before her coronation and before her execution. And sadly, they are also completely lost. So it'd be lovely to be able to recreate them, definitely. On the subject of Anne Boleyn, there's always a question that people obsess over, and it's when was she born? Now, obviously, we can't be certain either way, but I am 99% certain that she was born in 1507. And I say that knowing that most people think 1501. I would say it's probably like a 70-30 split. So 70% think 1501, 30% 1507. There's the occasional maverick like Sylvia Barbara Soberton, the lovely Sylvia, who throw 1504 into the mix. But generally it's 1501 and 1507. So the reason that a lot of people go with 1501, really, I think the only piece of evidence to really back that up is the letter. So there is a letter that Anne Boleyn wrote to her father from France when she was a young girl. And the opinion is that the handwriting is just far too advanced and neat for, as she would have been, a 6-7-year-old if she were born in 1507. And I get it. I've read that. I've seen that letter. I've read the contents, and it is grown up for a 6-year-old. But we know Anne Boleyn was extremely intelligent, very precocious. Perhaps she just had a very, very neat hand. I know we can't really compare it, but my nephew, Henry, who's 8, I saw some of his handwriting the other day compared to a friend of his, and Henry's was streets ahead. But they're exactly the same age. They've been educated together. So, I think there are instances where people just had a much better hand, even as children. And I would say that is really, it's the only thing that does add a lot of weight to 1501, because it, even based on what I've just said, it is a very, very grown-up hand. But the reason I think 1507 makes more sense is that I would say that there is a lot more logical evidence to support it. And I think the single biggest thing is that Anne's age is never brought up, or at least to the best of our knowledge, it's never brought up. And we also have to consider Henry VIII's desires from Anne Boleyn, namely, I want you to give me loads of sons. I mean, that is literally, if we bottle it, if we narrow it down, that is why he was wanting to marry her. He wanted lots and lots of sons. If Anne Boleyn were born in 1501, then the point at which she is marrying Henry, she is 32, 33, which is getting on by Tudor standards. Henry VIII's grandmother, Elizabeth Woodville, had, I think, 8 children by the age of 33. His mother, Elizabeth of York, dies on her 37th birthday, having given birth to 7 children in total, off the top of my head. So the fact that if Anne Boleyn were born in 1501, she'd have been in her early 30s by the point she is having her first child. Now, you can argue, of course, well, it took 7 years for them to get the annulment and the marriage, which is true. But in those 7 long years, Anne's age, to the best of our knowledge, is never mentioned. It is never brought up, even by someone like Chapuis, who loathed Anne Boleyn. He described her as a thin old woman towards the end of her reign, but it is never brought up in the run-up to getting the marriage to Catherine annulled and the marriage to Anne Boleyn happening. And I just feel like it would have been brought up if she were in her early 30s at the point she's marrying Henry. But it's never brought up. Never. And the other thing is that we also if we look at Henry VIII's pattern with wives, Catherine of Aragon was 22 when he married her. Jane Seymour was around 26. Anne of Cleves was 24. Catherine Howard could have been as young as 15, 16, probably more like 18. Yes, Catherine Parr is in her early 30s, but it's at the very end of Henry VIII's reign when, realistically, he was looking for companionship. So there alone tells us that Henry VIII held by the standards of the conventional standards of the time. So that he would have chosen a woman that he wants lots of children by, who is at the point she's marrying him, early 30s. To me, it is illogical. It doesn't actually add up. And I feel like it would have been spoken about. And it wasn't. It was not mentioned. There's also the Duchess of Feria, who was a very close friend of Mary I. She later commented that Anne Boleyn had died having not reached her 29th year. And this is a woman who would have had access to that kind of information. Another thing that we should consider is marriage prospects, or lack thereof. In reality, the main reason that Anne Boleyn was brought back from France was that Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, was attempting to broker a marriage betrothal between her and her distant cousin James Butler. Thomas Boleyn was fighting with James Butler's father over who should be the Earl of Ormond, an Irish earldom. So that marriage prospect fell through in 1523. In that same year, the potential love affair between Anne Boleyn and Henry Percy, the heir to the Earl of Northumberland, came to light and was quickly squashed by Cardinal Wolsey. We then have 4 years of apparently no further marriage prospects for Anne Boleyn. Had she been born in 1501, then she would have been between 22 and 26 in that time. Now, we know Thomas Boleyn was ambitious. Surely he would have sought another advantageous marriage for his daughter at this point. Were she born in 1507, then she would have been between 16 and 20 in the years 1523 to 1527, and thus no real urgency to get her married. So those are the reasons why I go with 1507. I am happy to be proven wrong, but I don't think I am. As far as controversial opinions, I'm sorry to say that the next couple of questions are going to be very Anne Boleyn heavy, and I've just spent the last 15 minutes talking about her. But I've broken it again into controversial opinions based on fact and then some TV and film. And my controversial opinion in TV and film is that I hated Natalie Dormer as Anne Boleyn, and I know people loved her as Anne Boleyn, and I am afraid I really didn't. Now, I hasten to add I love Natalie Dormer. She played one of my very favourite characters in Game of Thrones, Marjorie Tyrell. I think she's a brilliant actress. Nothing against her personally. I think she's brilliant. Just didn't like her as Anne. I thought she overacted quite a lot. I thought it just was too bombastic for me. It wasn't contained. It wasn't, as far as I saw it, it wasn't nuanced. I just found her, I found her over the top as Anne, and so I struggled with it. But I know I'm in the minority there. Actually, Sarah Morris and I, who's my business partner on Simply Tudor Tours, the historic tour company that she and I run together, we always joke and disagree on this one because she adored Natalie Dormer as Anne Boleyn, and I disliked her, and I adored Claire Foy, and Sarah hated Claire Foy as Anne Boleyn for the reasons that she found Claire Foy wooden and abrasive and aggressive, and she was all of those things, but I think that's what made her performance amazing. I loved Claire Foy as Anne. I loved the Cromwell affectation, the suddenly changing into French. I just thought it was brilliant, and obviously that is the writing of the late Dame Hilary Mantel. But yeah, I'm afraid I did not care for Natalie Dormer as Anne Boleyn. As far as a controversial opinion based on fact, and I'm sorry, I'm sticking with Anne Boleyn, I'm not unsure if it would constitute a controversial opinion, but I genuinely believe that Anne Boleyn was the love of Henry VIII's life. Now, a good friend of mine is the historian Dr Estelle Perronc, and Estelle hates Henry VIII. Understandable. And she thinks was incapable of love. I disagree. I think he was very much a product of his time and a product of those around him just constantly saying yes. I think they almost made a rod for their own back. Obviously, cutting the head off a woman that you loved is not exactly suggestive of love. But I think that Henry and Anne were, and I've described them as this several times, but I think they were a bit like the Burton and Taylor, so Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. I think their love was that type, that sort of really, really intense, can't live without love that's so passionate and so raw and so real that it was only ever going to explode in the end. And I think that is what happened with Henry and Anne. I do think that she was the love of his life. I don't for one second think it was Jane Seymour. I think Jane Seymour just had the luxury of not disappointing him. She gave him a son. We should be under no illusions that had Anne Boleyn given Henry VIII sons, as would have Catherine of Aragon, they'd have both been totally secure. Catherine, I mean, my mum has always said no, the love of his life was Catherine of Aragon. And I get that, I do understand that. But I see her more as Henry's first teenage love. But as far as genuine passion and in many respects compatibility, I think it was Anne Boleyn. I really do. So if I had an opportunity to host a dinner party and invite 5 figures from history, who would I choose? Well, Anne Boleyn, obviously. Let's get past her. I don't need to explain why. Then who would I have? Eleanor of Aquitaine, I think, because I would just love to know what a woman from 800 years ago, what did she How does she carry herself? What did the clothing actually look like? What were the colours? How does she sound? I think that's the thing that I'm always fascinated by as well, is that we don't have portraits of the early Plantagenets, but we do of the Tudors. But one thing we can never, ever know is how these people sounded. What was the quality of Anne Boleyn's voice? What was the tone? What was the pitch? And the same for Eleanor. I mean, she'd have to try and learn English, which I don't believe she did speak, and I don't speak French, apart from a little bit here and there. But Eleanor of Aquitaine, Anne Boleyn, probably Queen Mary I, which could be a bit awkward with Anne Boleyn. But again, I'd love to see her and what was she like. I've read descriptions of her as being really tiny and bone thin and having these incredibly piercing eyes that could be quite frightening. By all accounts, actually, she was just very short-sighted. So when she turned her gaze on someone and really sort of squinted, it was because she had poor eyesight. But I'd love to know what Mary was really like. So that's 3. Maybe Margaret of Anjou, for similar reasons. I'd just love to know what this woman was actually like. We have such a image of her, I think, thanks to the work of Philippa Gregory, as being this villain, that I would just love to know how this woman behaved, what made her tick. And then it's going to be a really tough one. It would be another woman. If I was going to pick a guy, it'd be Edward IV, because I would just love to know if he was as sexy as everyone says, which his portraits don't hold up, in my opinion. But it'd be interesting to chat to Edward IV. But I think I would probably go for Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, given that I wrote a book about her. I'd love to, chat to her. And meeting her would confirm whether the portrait that is believed to be her is indeed her. I think it is. I think it firmly is. And the reason for that is the couple of pieces of jewellery that the sitter wears. If you've not heard of this before, Google Margaret Pole and then look very closely on her right wrist. There's a pendant hanging from the bracelet that she wears, and the pendant's a barrel of wine, which is very suggestive of the death of her father, who was drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. And then there's also a big W pendant, which is very likely for Warwick, her maternal family. So I think it would be those 5. Anne Boleyn, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen Mary I, Margaret Pole, Margaret of Anjou, and then if I can squeeze Edward IV in, although that could be, again, very awkward with Margaret of Anjou, but it wouldn't be a very good dinner party if there wasn't some drama. So then finally, I was asked people, what are they working on at the moment? Well, I'm always working on my tour company business. So as I've mentioned a couple of times, I run a tour company with Sarah Morris, who many of you will know as the Tudor Travel Guide. And we created this tour company a couple of years ago. It's called Simply Tudor Tours, and we basically organise week-long, in-person, highly curated tours, generally based around a theme, be it the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn or the early years of Mary Queen of Scots, which is our May tour next year. Our July tour next year is retracing a progress in 1502 that Henry VII and Elizabeth of York took. So we create these in-person tours and we go from place to place. We stay overnight in amazing hotels. Sarah and I are with everyone on the tour throughout the whole week. We're there every step of the way. We bring in guest historians like Estelle Perronc, Nathan Amen, who's speaking on our 1502 Progress Tour. And they're just amazing. We recreate Tudor experiences. We have these lovely dinners. So that takes up a lot of my time because I do all of the logistics side of things because of my old event experience. Then I obviously have the podcast, and then I also write. So I'm currently working on my next book. And with this one, I can't actually say because it's with my agent and it's being shopped around the different publishing houses at the moment. Although I've spoken to quite a few people about it already, so I'm sure people out there know. But I am writing another book. It'll be a bit of a beast. It's never been done before. And we'll be focusing on let's say the other side of the coin. I'm going to leave it at that. So that's me. That brings me to the end of the episode. Hopefully people have found that interesting and you feel like you know me a bit better now. If you've got any questions based on anything I've said, or there's something that you'd love to ask me that I didn't cover, please do drop me a message on Instagram, or if you're a follower on Patreon, You can message me there. Next week, I'm back to regular programming with a guest. I've got Miranda Kaufman coming on to speak about her book, Black Tudors. So people of colour who were alive during the Tudor era and had this, I think that is a period of history that we would suppose naively assume wasn't really a thing, but it absolutely was. And Miranda has written the most remarkable book. It's been out for a couple of years now, actually, but wrote the most amazing book, Black Tudors, about the story of black people in Tudor England. And she and I are going to be diving into that next Thursday. So that's the end of the episode. Thank you again for tuning in and hearing all about me, I guess. Speak to you next week.